Welcome back to the Constitutional Clarion. Some of you may have looked at the list of the new Ministry of the Albanese Government and been rather confused by all the different categories of executive officers in that list. So that's what I'm going to discuss today. If you look at that list, first of all, there are the cabinet ministers, of which there are 23. Then there are ministers in the outer ministry, of which there are 7, and another 12 assistant ministers. At the bottom, you'll find 7 special envoys. So what do all those categories mean, and where do parliamentary secretaries fit in? The first thing to note is how many of these people there are. The Constitution initially confined the number of ministers to just 7. Apparently, you now need 42 people to do the same job, plus 7 special envoys. It rather has the appearance of the kindergarten approach of everyone gets a prize. As mentioned in my last video, Section 4 of the Ministers of State Act 1952 says that the number of ministers designated as parliamentary secretaries must not exceed 12 and the number of other ministers must not exceed 30. In the current ministerial list, the parliamentary secretaries are described as assistant ministers, and I'll explain why shortly. The special envoys are not counted as ministers at all. At the Commonwealth level, a distinction is drawn between cabinet ministers and those in the outer ministry. Now, this largely arises from practicality. There's a limit to the number of people that you can reasonably put around a table and have a proper discussion with. So we have 23 who sit permanently in cabinet, while the ministers in the outer ministry can be invited to cabinet if a matter relevant to their ministry is being discussed. The Commonwealth Constitution contains a number of provisions that define ministers and address their remuneration and disqualification. First, Section 64 of the Constitution refers to ministers of state for the Commonwealth as being officers appointed to administer departments of state of the Commonwealth. Section 65 then puts a limit on the number of ministers until Parliament otherwise provides, and says that ministers hold such offices as the Governor-General directs. Section 66 adds to that until Parliament otherwise provides, the amount of money payable out of the Consolidated Revenue Fund to pay ministers cannot exceed £12,000 a year. Now, of course, Parliament has otherwise provided, and that's now extended by Section 55 of the Parliamentary Business Resources Act 2017 to a maximum of $5 million or a higher amount as prescribed by a method set out in the regulations. Regulation 96 of the Parliamentary Business Resources Regulations 2017 provides a method of calculation that takes into account any increase in the base salary of a Member of Parliament. For example, a parliamentary secretary receives an additional 25% of a parliamentarian's base salary, while a cabinet minister receives an additional 72.5% of that base salary, and the Prime Minister receives an extra 160%. As a consequence, that $5 million cap in the legislation keeps increasing. The final piece of this puzzle is the infamous Section 44 of the Constitution. This is the disqualification provision for MPs and senators. One of the disqualifications applies to a person who holds any office of profit under the Crown. That means that if a person holds a governmental position, like being a public servant, to which duties of some kind of employment attach, and there's a right to receive remuneration for it, even if the person refuses to take that money, they are disqualified from being a Member of Parliament. As with most things, there are a lot of qualifications and technicalities about it, which I'm not going to go into here, otherwise I'd take a very long time, but I did write a detailed paper on it for the Commonwealth Parliamentary Library, which you can find online if you're interested. For present purposes, the office of a minister would ordinarily be regarded as an office of profit under the Crown. But there is a specific exemption in section 44 for anyone holding the office of any of the Queen's Ministers of State for the Commonwealth. It's clear from all of this that ministers appointed to administer departments are ministers of the Crown whose remuneration must fall within those limits set by legislation, and they are not disqualified from Parliament for holding an office of profit under the Crown. However, what about the parliamentary secretaries? These are members of Parliament who are appointed to assist ministers with their executive functions. There's long been a concern that if they are paid and therefore hold a governmental office of profit, they'll be disqualified from Parliament. That actually happened in India in 2018 when 20 MLAs in Delhi were held to be disqualified from Parliament because they were parliamentary secretaries and therefore held offices of profit under the Crown. See, we use those same words in a number of different constitutions around the world. In Australia, most of the Australian states have dealt with this by including express provisions in their constitutions stating that parliamentary secretaries are not disqualified. But, as we all know, the Commonwealth Constitution is not so easily amended. Various methods have been used to try and get around that problem at the Commonwealth level. At first, parliamentary secretaries were just not paid, so they didn't hold an office of profit. The Bruce Ministry later used a rather sneaky method of getting around it by paying more money to the ministers and then getting those ministers to give some of that money to the parliamentary secretaries. Now, they argued that this was then a personal arrangement, so it wasn't an office of profit under the Crown, but it was pretty dubious. When the Parliamentary Secretaries Act 1980 was enacted, formalising the position, it was stated in the second reading speech that the positions could not be remunerated because of that risk of disqualification under section 44. This problem wouldn't arise if they were regarded as ministers. But the view was taken that to be a minister, they would have to administer a department under section 64 of the Constitution. If a department could only be administered by one minister, then there just weren't enough departments to go around to cover all the parliamentary secretaries. But some people argued that a department could be administered by more than one minister, and that would solve the problem. In 1987, the Commonwealth Solicitor General, Gavin Griffith, advised the Commonwealth that more than one minister could administer a department. However, it wasn't until 2000 that the Howard government bit the bullet and amended the Ministers of State Act to declare that all parliamentary secretaries were ministers and to appoint them all to administer departments, with departments having more than one minister. Usually there was a senior minister who sat in cabinet along with one or more junior ministers or parliamentary secretaries. Later, these parliamentary secretaries came to be described as assistant ministers to emphasise their ministerial status. The terms parliamentary secretary and assistant minister actually mean the same thing in Australia, although not always in other countries where sometimes a parliamentary secretary may have only a parliamentary role rather than an executive one. The validity of this new system was challenged and upheld by the High Court in the case of Re Patterson ex parte Taylor in 2001. Senator Patterson was a parliamentary secretary who had been appointed to administer the Department of Immigration and Multicultural Affairs, even though there was already a minister, a senior minister being Philip Ruddock, who was administering that department as well. The validity of a decision made by Senator Patterson under legislation was challenged. The challenge failed. Chief Justice Gleeson stressed that The provisions in the Constitution concerning executive arrangements were intended to be flexible. He considered that there was nothing inconsistent with Section 64 of the Constitution in appointing two persons to administer a department, or in having more than one person who's responsible to Parliament for the administration of the department. The other members of the court who addressed the issue agreed with him. On this basis, the appointment of paid parliamentary secretaries as ministers who administer a department of state with other, more senior ministers would not result in a breach of Section 44(4) of the Constitution, because it would fall under that exception concerning the Queen's Ministers of State for the Commonwealth. One consequence of this is that we now have a few very large departments with a number of ministers, including assistant ministers, also known as parliamentary secretaries, appointed to administer them. For example, administering the Department of Home Affairs, you now have Tony Burke as the Minister for Home Affairs, Minister for Immigration and Citizenship, and Minister for Cyber Security. Then you have Anne Ali as the Minister for Multicultural Affairs and Christy McBain as the Minister for Emergency Management. To add to that, you have three separate assistant ministers covering immigration, emergency management, and citizenship, customs and multicultural affairs. In practice, these ministers would divide up responsibilities so that an assistant minister will deal with a particular area and often do more low-level administrative work, while the cabinet ministers make the bigger policy decisions. What about special envoys? The term seems to have been adopted from the world of diplomacy. A special envoy can address a particular issue in international forums and across a range of countries, rather than being an ambassador accredited to particular countries. Philip Ruddock was made a special envoy on human rights by the Foreign Minister in 2016, but he was not remunerated because of Section 44 of the Constitution. The title of Special Envoy was later adopted as a means of occupying members of Parliament who were not in the ministry and making them feel very special. It was initially used to deal with dumped leaders, giving them something to do. Hence, Tony Abbott was made Special Envoy for Indigenous Affairs, and Barnaby Joyce was made Special Envoy to drought-affected regional Australia. Abbott was asked to provide monthly reports and to present findings to relevant cabinet committees. While not remunerated, these roles do come with perks such as extra staff and widespread travel. For example, it was reported in the press that Mr. Joyce claimed $675,000 in expenses during his 9 months in the role of Special Envoy. There was also media controversy about the extent of the contribution that was made by these Special Envoys. There was criticism of the failure to publicly issue a report of their activities. When in an estimates committee, the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet was asked about what the drought Special Envoy was expected to deliver, it stated that he was to provide feedback to the Prime Minister on the impact of the drought and advice about relief efforts and proposals emerging from the community. No public report was required. After questions concerning Mr. Abbott's role as envoy, his letter of appointment was released, showing that he was asked to engage with Indigenous communities affected by poor school attendance and performance, and advise the Prime Minister about what was working, what was not, and how things could be improved. The Albanese Government has made use of special envoys in a different way. Apart from the appointment of an elder, Senator Pat Dodson, as Special Envoy for Reconciliation and the implementation of the Uluru Statement, the Albanese Government has tended to appoint envoys from among more junior MPs as a stepping stone towards becoming an assistant minister and then moving up the ranks into cabinet. In 2024, for example, there was a Special Envoy for Social Cohesion, a Special Envoy for Defence, Veterans Affairs and Northern Australia, and a Special Envoy for Cyber Security and Digital Resilience. It is seen as both a training ground as well as an opportunity to place a focus on subjects that might otherwise be regarded as neglected. The current list of special envoys covers a range of different issues, from men's health to Indian Ocean affairs. I've been unable to unearth, however, any clear delineation of the role and powers of special envoys and what outputs are expected of them. At best, I could find scraps of information arising from answers to questions in estimates committees. I fear that this remains a nebulous category of government official, which does need greater explanation to the public and, frankly, justification. Thank you once again for watching the Constitutional Clarion, and as always, I look forward to seeing you next time. Goodbye.